George, there's a very tense standoff happening right now between India and China in the Himalayas. These two countries have a history. In 1962, they went to war over the same sorts of issues. What's going on there, and how serious could this get?
Well, right now, it's not very serious at all. It's dueling up in the Himalayas. What it really is meaning here is that the Chinese are developing an interest in crossing over the Himalayas at some point, not now, pushing southward into contact with Bangladesh, perhaps, a country that sometimes has hostile relationships with India, and developing a presence in the Indian Ocean. Is this going to turn into that? Probably not. Are we in a situation that we really haven't seen quite to this extent in over 50 years? Yes.
So these two countries obviously have very, I think the term the New York Times used was muscular leaders. And both of these men have an incentive to make sure that they follow through on what they're saying they're going to do. Does that cause you any more concern at looking at this situation?
Well, the babble of politicians doesn't interest me very much. The fact is, these are two very large, substantially powerful countries with diverging interests, and at some point, that's going to manifest itself. And what we're seeing here is that friction breaking out. Look, the real issue is geographic. One country stands on each side of the Himalayas. The Himalayas are extremely high mountains, very hard to operate in. Takes a week to acclimate a soldier to be able to do that. It's not easy to fight. There are very few roads going through there. So you really can't fight a war. But if the Indians, for example, got control of Tibet, extreme idea, but imagine that, they would be in a position to really endanger China itself. Imagine that the Chinese got hold of Bhutan or Nepal. Now they'd be on the other side of the Himalayas, they're positioned to operate. So right now you've got a wall between these two countries. On the one side you have China, on the other side you have India. But if either side breaches that wall, the balance of power shifts. Neither side is strong enough to do it. Each is experimenting in some way. Tibet by China, India by supporting the Dalai Lama, the Chinese by supporting radicals in Nepal, for example. That's political. This time, about 6,000 troops, 3,000 on each side, met at a very desolate place in the world and have been exchanging fire, and they don't seem to want to stop.
So it seems to, I think, many observers that China is in the midst of a lot of, for lack of a better way of describing it, geographic conflicts, whether it be the Sea of Japan, or sorry, the South China Sea, or the Sea of Japan, what's happening obviously in between them and India. What is the impetus? What's driving China's move to start? For a long time, these conflicts were at least frozen, or to some degree, not really. There was nothing happening, and now there is. What's driving that?
Well, first, let's establish that neither the South China Sea or the East China Sea or here is a great deal happening. There's a great deal of movement of ships and people, and the media is picking it up. But the Chinese are actually being extremely cautious, not rhetorically, but in point of fact, not to engage any of these people. What is going on is that China is going through a transition. It was the majestic economic power of the world up until 2008. It no longer is. Its exports have fallen. It has social tensions. It has shifted from a authoritarian regime to a pretty full dictatorship. And that dictatorship has to legitimize itself. It has to show that it's powerful. By taking these minimal moves all around its frontiers, it can publicize that the Indians are falling back in front of the Chinese forces. Not that they are, but they can claim that. They can claim that the Americans are frightened about the Chinese Navy. They aren't, but they can claim that. They can do all these things for internal reasons. But in the end, the South China Sea really matters to the Chinese for their trade. In the end, having access to the Indian Ocean really matters to them. So one thing that's happening is just political. Another thing that's happening is geopolitical, in the sense that these are the natural movements of great powers against each other.
Okay, final question for you. Can India really compete with China militarily? Would India rely on the United States if some sort of wider conflict ever were to break out?
India has an extremely large military. It has a pretty good military. Certainly, it is not afraid of engaging the Chinese in the Himalayas. They're toe-to-toe and they're doing just fine. And they also understand that if the Chinese were to advance into India, they would be advancing into hostile territory, their line of supply going back to China over the Himalayas, and they'd be highly vulnerable. So the answer is, you're not talking about two powers that aren't peer powers. You can argue whether the Air Force of one is better than the Air Force of the other, but in the end, whoever's on the defense is going to be stronger.
Well, George Friedman, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.